Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture. The topic this week is the denial of the magnitude of the problem. I'm Will Valley. I use he, him pronouns, and this week I'm presenting from the unceded traditional territory of the Syilx people, Interior Salish, currently known as Penticton, British Columbia. So this week, we're going to delve a bit deeper into the magnitude of the issues and the challenges that we're facing in our current times. And we want to begin by talking a bit about this paradox we seem to be in, where humanity is now powerful enough to disrupt entire ecosystems, entire geoclimatic cycles, but we're not capable, or we're unlikely capable of repairing or recovering from disruption. So it's quite a challenging paradox to be in, where we embrace and celebrate and understand the immense ability to engage with, disrupt, interrupt, work through certain global cycles, but we can't seem to be able to uncouple ourselves from this destructive patterns. As we move forward, it's really interesting to look at the layers, not just within the course, but the layers of the narratives we see in media, we see in school. We tell each other in many different ways of how great we are, while at the same time not recognizing how impactful this greatness is on our entire livelihoods. And so as we're in an educational setting, it brings us back to one of the first questions that started this course. And that is, what is education for? So what is education for? And in one of our readings, Grande talks explicitly about this challenge, this paradox of education itself, and those working within educational settings and educational institutes, recognizing the harms folks are enduring, the harms being perpetuated, but also seeing educational spaces as spaces where we might be able to interrupt and disrupt and move towards something else, something that's unknown right now, but the horizon is there. And how do we capture that? And so the challenge is recognizing that education is often seen as a path towards upward mobility and material wealth. However, we could also see it as a means toward eradicating oppression in all its forms. And that, the magnitude of that issue and the overlapping and the intersection, compounding problems of the oppressions in all its forms is what this week's modules, the module for this unit is all about. So looking at the different layers, and you'll notice that starting from module 1 through 4, elements of each module will start popping up in this one as well. And that is really the breadth of the situation and the challenges that we're trying to address right now and trying to think through and sit with. And remembering that other courses, other approaches often want to deny or to deflect or to move away from sitting with this magnitude, whereas this week it really is about being open to allowing the depths of the magnitudes to come in and to sit with them responsibly and to learn from what we think, what we do, the urges that come up while we're in these spaces. So I'll pass it back over to Vanessa. We'll talk a little bit about how we're framing some more of this week's readings and some more of this week's speakers, and to bring it back to acknowledging the different approaches to addressing this denial of the magnitude of the problem.
So you would have probably noticed that in the previous units, we have made an effort to be able to braid the knowledge coming from BIPOC people and non-BIPOC people together, and to emphasize the contributions of BIPOC, the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So this week is going to be a bit different. We prioritized the finding speakers and voices for whom the denial of the magnitude of the problem had set in, and people who are working in this area and failing, and so that they can share with you a little bit of what it is like not to turn your back to that and not to turn away. So you'll see that the balance that you found in the other units might not have been achieved representationally this week, and that we have to talk about the limits of representation at some point as well, which is probably not right now. It's addressed in some of the readings of this week as well, but we will focus on how to hold space for all the layers that are going that are heavy right now, right? And how to work in institutions with these layers. I think that's what that's what was driving our decisions for this week's learning and unlearning bundle. So back to Will.
Thanks, Vanessa. And so the rest of this lecture is going to be brought to you by Dan McCarthy, and he's an associate professor in the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo, as well as a faculty member and the director of the Waterloo Institute of Social Innovation and Resilience. What's interesting about Dan's video, the short video that's coming up, he's going to highlight 3 dimensions of systems thinking. So this systems thinking has emerged from cybernetics and a very scientific, positive way of seeing the world. It emerged from there, but has advanced over the past 7 decades, to broaden its understanding and to kind of counter scientific reductionism, and not in a way that dismisses scientific reductionism, but really supplements and broadens our capacity to see systems in the world. And so Dan's going to present three tools, three contributions of a particular way of seeing systems that will be really helpful in helping us understand the depths and the levels and the ways to intervene and understand systemic change. So one of the most important parts of the denial of the magnitude of the problem is the denial of understanding systems. And so what Dan is offering are some tools to help put some cracks in that denial of not seeing systems, and really asking us to broaden our understanding of how systems interact. There's a bit of layering with last week's content lectures, where I talked a little bit specifically about dissipative structures. So that's emerges from systems theory. So Dan will talk about systems archetypes, so common patterns that we see in systems, but because they're systemic, they're often hard to recognize until someone points them out, and then they become quite more common and quite more obvious. Because although scientific reductionism and the capacity to eliminate distractions, eliminate the noise, we can focus on single variables, is a very powerful and common way of knowing. One part of our socialization that starts very early in the global north and in Western education is this belief that we can separate reality into discrete subjects: biology, chemistry, math, social studies, geography. It's interesting to realize how deep that goes into our understanding of the world itself. And so the systems archetypes helps kind of push us towards recognizing that although systemic issues and systems are hard to see and recognize, there are distinct patterns that we can use and learn from as we're navigating systems and systemic change. The second tool he's going to introduce is boundaries and bounded rationality. So what are the implications of having by necessity, we need to choose boundaries to understand systems, but when we don't recognize that we're doing that, what are the pitfalls? What are the traps that occur when we start thinking that what we've bounded is all there is and is separate from everything else? And the third part of Dan's lecture. So we've got systems archetypes, bounded rationalities, and then leverage points. And leverage points are interesting parts of systems where we may or may not have more power to shift a system towards something different. And always with the caveat that one thing we can guarantee with humans is that whenever we do try and intervene, we have a good track record of not intervening very well. So leverage points are very interesting focal points within systems, but also with the caveat that what we always considered a powerful leverage point may push us towards some unintended consequences, and it also may push us towards into feedback loops and balance loops that actually are positive. So Dan's going to go into much more detail, outlining and give some practical examples of how these 3 systems tools can be useful for understanding the magnitude of the problem, but also for understanding how we tend to fail to think about systemic issues when we get trapped in kind of a scientific reductionist or a way of seeing the world that does separate and delineate within and between systems. So really excited for you to encounter Dan's work and Dan's lecture. And we'll have some questions in the learning bundle that I'll ask you to take the tools that Dan is presenting and unpack some of the readings and some of the issues and cases in the readings to see if you can make the connection to what Dan is pointing out and how it's also being reproduced and pointed out in our readings. So I think that's it for Vanessa and I today. And we're really looking forward to unpacking and hearing your perspectives in the tutorial. And so thank you very much and have a great week.
Good day. My name is Dan McCarthy. I'm a white, cisgendered, heterosexual male whose ancestors came to Turtle Island, what is now known as Ontario, Canada, mostly from Ireland, counties Offaly, Cork, and Dublin in about the 1840s, and benefited from broken treaty promises, and I continue to benefit from those. Usually I'm on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, where I live and work, as well as the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Grand River, and their Haldimand Tract, which was promised to them. I am currently in the land of my ancestors, a couple of counties away from some of the counties where my ancestors lived, in County Limerick, visiting my daughter and new son-in-law. I'm a professor in the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability, as well as the director of the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience at the University of Waterloo. My background is systems thinking, environmental policy, and I have had the privilege of working in and with a number of Indigenous communities and nations and organizations in Canada for the last 15 or so years, and trying to use some of these tools of systems thinking to help mostly people that look like me to understand some of the biases that they carry into some of these interactions with Indigenous communities and Indigenous organizations. And so I tried to do what Vanessa Andriotti refers to as a bit of anti-assholism. I've had to do some of that work on myself. I'm just at the beginning of that journey, but I feel like some of these tools can be really helpful in engaging, especially people that look like me, and using some of these tools from Western science to help understand some of the biases. And so these systems-based tools are really helpful in broader notions of social change. Today, I'm going to introduce a few basic definitions of systems thinking, relate ideas around systems thinking and action in complex systems, and then introduce three tools that I hope will be useful to you: system archetypes, system boundaries, and leverage points. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint slide deck. So if you'll bear with me, I'll just get it started here. And there's my name and various titles at the University of Waterloo and our WISER logo. So I wanted to begin just with a couple of basic definitions. This was from Danella Meadows, who is a very well-respected and now deceased member of the systems thinking community. She wrote a wonderful little book called Thinking in Systems, a primer. She defines systems as a set of things, people, cells, molecules, or whatever, interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior, that it can emerge or self-organize. The system can be buffeted, constricted, or triggered by outside forces, by other parts of the system or other scales within the system. But the system's response to these forces is characteristic of itself, and that response is seldom simple in the real world. And so what we have in this definition is the idea that systems are essentially self-organizing. They exhibit emergent properties, things we can talk about throughout the presentation, as well as responding to stresses from and other kinds of constraints and interventions from the broader system, and the way that they interact with those is unique to a particular system. But there are broad patterns that we can speak about. Another definition is this idea of complex adaptive systems. This is from the late Brenda Zimmerman. Complex implies diversity, a great number of connections between a wide variety of elements. Adaptive suggests the capacity to alter or change or even learn, and the ability to learn from experience. A system is a set of interconnected or independent things, and these things in a complex adaptive system are independent agents. And again, sort of some of the key themes here about individual agents exhibiting their own behavior that is self-organizing in response to broader system changes and adapting or learning as a response. And again, unique patterns, but also some broad patterns that we can recognize as broadly systemic. The last definition I'll offer you is the term autopoiesis, which is Greek for auto meaning self and poiesis meaning creation. And this very simply is the fact that complex adaptive systems are ultimately self-creating systems. And this is based on the work of Maturin and Varela, two Chilean biologists that were looking at the sort of qualifying conditions for living systems. And so this came down to the fact that living systems produce and maintain themselves, that they are self-producing. And the system is capable of reproducing and maintaining itself. And this metaphor is really useful when we're thinking about complex adaptive systems like ecosystems, but also institutions, because they can seem to resist our interventions. They seem to be alive in that regard, and that they are self-producing, and that oftentimes they are trying to maintain themselves. And while it may seem logical from an external point of view for them to change, they may resist that change, trying to maintain themselves. Related to that is this work of Otto Scharmer and the idea of theory U, which if you haven't heard of, it's worthwhile looking into. He talks about the quality of results achieved by any system as a function of the quality of the awareness that people in these systems operate from. So in 3 words, form follows consciousness. In this sense, then, if we can continue to grow in our appreciation of complexity, not be threatened by it, develop what many theorists refer to as negative capability, and can sit in complexity and learn from it, we have a much better chance of being able to deal with complex adaptive systems. And in thinking about our ability to respond to complexity, this is from the work of Dave Snowden. On a good day, your brain picks up about 5% of what you might perceive. And it does this through a couple of different kinds of functions. The first one is autonomic function, a sort of first fit pattern match, which processes things at an astronomical speed of 20 million items per second. And this is evidenced by my experience in camping, where I've learned 2 very important things: fire hot and knife sharp. If you get your hand too close to the fire, of course, your first fit pattern match would be to pull it away very quickly, and the brain does this very, very quickly. Rarely, though, when things don't go as we perceive them to, and our habitual consciousness or our typical patterns of thought and behavior don't work. If I was trapped in a nuclear reactor, I might feel heat on my hand, but that autonomic function of pulling it back wouldn't do me much good, because I'd already be exposed to an astronomical amount of radiation. And so if I did have the ability to do something about it, it would require a novelty receptive part of the brain, which is a best fit pattern match, which is if a first fit pattern match doesn't work, you have to kick this part of this kind of function of the brain in, and it processes things at much slower speed. We rarely kick in this novelty receptive function of our brain. And so we're always dealing with our own or other people's fragmented perception of the past and the present. And this is where, for instance, Jungian depth therapy comes in, where we need to actually delve into where the patterns of thought and behavior came from. And they may come from way back in our past, pre-development of the ego when we're very young, and interactions with our parents, for instance. And those kinds of entrained patterns follow us through, or patterns of thought and behavior carry through, and really limit our ability to kick in that novelty receptive function of the brain, because we are used to that kind of first fit pattern match working. So it's useful to build a capacity, a negative capability, or a practice to be able to try to interrupt that autonomic function of the brain, that habitual consciousness, as Bosnak, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst, refers to it, or what we might also call, what Jung called the ego. The most important implications of the correspondence between Jung's theory, this is a quote from Van Eenwijk's book, where he brought together Jungian psychoanalysis and chaos theory, or the complexity theory. Jung's theories and chaos research is that the fantasies about order, and he really emphasized that, that spurious product of reductionism being the most desirable state of being, are slowly giving way to the realization that chaos is far healthier than previously imagined. You might say, chaos, that's really scary. But actually, what we're talking about is a particular form of chaos, deterministic chaos versus entropic chaos. And I'll just flash forward here, and here's the distinction. So entropic chaos is where we never resolve back into patterns. It's order seems to simply deteriorate into total disorder, never to return. And this is sort of the heat death of the universe that astronomers speak about. That is most people's understanding of chaos. So when we think about order versus chaos, our ego, our habitual consciousness prefers order. We know we can predict within that. But actually what many people are understanding, Jungian psychoanalysts, chaos and complexity researchers, is that chaos in particular form, deterministic chaos, a form of system behavior in which patterns or order periodically appear and disappear, is very healthy. And in fact, ecosystems demonstrate this, where they go through collapse and reorganization through fire or pest outbreaks. And this is very normal. And in fact, if you try to suppress a fire or pest outbreak, it results in oftentimes the collapse of the system. And so deterministic chaos represents a very healthy way to approach system behavior, both on a psychological level, but also an institutional level. And that's where we come to this idea of trying to get through stuck points. That in itself is a stuck point around this idea, this assumption of preferring order versus chaos. And so how do you kick in this novelty receptive function of our individual brains, but also the collective consciousness of an organization, and not have it fall prey to that sort of autonomic function, first fit pattern match, that sort of typical or even archetypal pattern of thought and behavior that we are used to, that has served us well in the past, but might actually be inhibiting us in the current context. And so I want to introduce this concept of a system archetype. And this is, of course, directly borrowed from the concept of a Jungian archetype in psychology, where you might have a maternal archetype, a sage archetype, a jester archetype. These are patterns of thought and behavior that are very typical or archetypal in the human collective consciousness, and that we sort of fall prey to. We enact them over and over again because they've worked in the past. Being the youngest of six, and by a long shot, one of the things that I developed very early on is the use of and overuse of the jester archetype. In my family, people were prone to raising their voices and getting very animated. And as a young person and substantially smaller and younger than everyone else at the time, I'm quite tall now, it was scary when people were to raise their voices and have animated discussions. And so what I found to be a useful coping mechanism was to, well, act silly and act like a jester, because all of a sudden a couple of wonderful things would happen. They would stop arguing, their voices would lower, they would turn to me and they would laugh. These were all wonderful things in my estimation at the time. Of course, they were paying attention to me, they were laughing at me, and they had stopped arguing. Well, I recognized many, many years later that my overuse, my unquestioned use of this jester archetype was actually becoming problematic. When a very dear colleague of mine came to me after a session that I was running in front of a mid-career professional development program, and he indicated to me that it's like, Dan, I love the self-deprecating humor, but you are our complexity expert, and in front of this crowd, which are all these amazing, innovators from across the country, very well-established people, you're actually undermining your authority in the room. And I hadn't thought of that before. That was an overuse of an archetype that I hadn't questioned. It was a first fit pattern match, and all of a sudden I had to kick in that novelty receptive part of my brain to find a new best fit pattern match. I didn't completely stop being a jester, but I questioned the overuse and the unquestioned use. And that's the power of an archetype. Well, not only did Jungian psychoanalysts discover this notion of an archetype, but people like Peter Senge in the 90s, when he wrote his book, The Fifth Discipline, and of course the fifth discipline is systems thinking, uncovered a number of typical or archetypal system behaviors within organizations, that we're trying to kick in this novelty receptive part of their consciousness and learn or become learning organizations. And that's where he came up with these set of patterns that he referred to as system archetypes, just like in the Jungian sense. These patterns can be thought of as strange attractors, so never repeating yet always resembling themselves. They are the epitome of a contradiction. This is directly from chaos research. Infinitely recognizable, but ultimately unpredictable. So we can't use these patterns to necessarily predict system behavior, only in a qualitative sense. It's like, I should probably stop overusing the jester archetype and start to figure out what other kinds of patterns of thought and behavior I can use in different contexts. That is a pattern of thought and behavior that may not look exactly the same over and over again. It's a strange attractor. Ecosystems demonstrate this, and I mentioned earlier about the collapse and reorganization and a linear succession of an ecosystem. That is itself a strange attractor. It's a pattern that is very useful in helping us to understand the dynamics of a system, but not necessarily predict exactly where a particular maple tree might grow and what its diameter or breast height might be, but rather that generally in southern Ontario and in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, in an upland area, you'll end up with a species assemblage of maple and beech, and then there'll be a fire or pest outbreak, and it'll collapse and reorganize and come back to maple and beech, but you won't necessarily know where individual maples and beeches are. So these are typical or archetypal patterns that Senge uncovered, and he developed a list of these, and several of these are sort of derivatives of some of the patterns, in particular the first two. And so all I'm going to produce or present here is the first two. There's a wonderful little article by William Braun that describes these, and I'm actually going to use some of his descriptions. But these archetypes can be really helpful in diagnosing patterns of thought and behavior within organizations, and then developing strategy about how to circumvent them. Just like I started to question through my colleague's intervention, my overuse of the jester archetype that I've been defaulting to that I didn't even know I was doing, and now try to invoke other kinds of patterns. You can do the same thing in your organization. If you're sensing this kind of archetype happening, you can go, oh, this is an archetype. How do we get out of this? How do we diffuse this? How do we disengage one of these feedback loops, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So the first one I want to talk about is this idea of limits to growth. And these are just oftentimes these archetypes are really just two interacting feedback loops, which feedback loops are a set of causal relations between variables. So change in variable A leads to change in variable B leads to change in variable C. But as opposed to being linear, where it just stops at C, the loop is actually closed where the change in variable C feeds back into its relationship with variable A, and it feeds into itself in a loop or a feedback loop. Now there's two qualitatively different kinds of feedback loops. There's a positive feedback loop or a reinforcing, as we have here on the left of this diagram, R. And that is typified by the example of use of a microphone. This is my microphone, and making a sound and getting that microphone a little too close to the amplifier that it's tethered to. The sound will be picked up by the microphone, amplified by the amplifier. The amplified sound will be picked up by the microphone, and that amplified sound will go back in and be amplified again. And you'll end up with a louder and louder and louder and louder sound going through. And if you've ever played with a microphone or an amplifier, you've probably made this mistake. That's a typical reinforcing, or what we call a positive, not in the normative sense, feedback loop. The other type is a balancing feedback loop, and your body temperature or the temperature in this room being regulated by a thermostat is a good example of a negative or balancing feedback loop, which is the feedback loop on the right. As the temperature in this room reaches a particular threshold, if we actually had air conditioning here, air conditioning would kick in, bring the temperature back down. It would hit another threshold at the low end, allow the temperature to come back up, kick in again, and it would go like this. And it would regulate, it's self-regulating or balancing. And those are the two kinds of feedback loops that I'm referring to here. Oftentimes these archetypes are non-linear. They involve feedback loops. And so they're a little bit difficult to predict. And when you have interacting feedback loops, where one can flip to another, it's really difficult to see the patterns. And so that's why Senge and other people like David Peter Stroh have used these to great effect to help organizations get out of these sort of stuck points. So this first archetype, or limits to growth, is something dynamic, hopefully, in your organization you've seen over time, where the first feedback loop is the reinforcing one on the left of the diagram is kicked in, where you see results, you increase your efforts, which increases results, and you have this nice nonlinear growth curve. Interestingly, in the Braun article, which I will circulate as part of this, he describes America Online as an example of this kind of dynamic. So if you don't remember, America Online, or AOL, was an internet provider way back when I was younger. And they recognized that if they cut prices and did heavy promotion, usually in the form of sending CDs around to as many people or as many households as possible, that their sales would increase. And this was a nice self-reinforcing feedback loop. The more they increased their sales, the more they were able to cut prices and do heavy promotion. CDs going out, they had this beautiful non-linear growth curve to their business and their profits. Unfortunately, there can often be a limiting factor which can flip the system from this nice reinforcing feedback loop to the balancing feedback loop. And all of a sudden you have a slowing of the growth curve, in fact, a diminishing of the growth curve. And that point, that limiting condition in the case of AOL was actually access to the network. So even though they were doing wonderful in terms of sales and doing heavy promotion, they actually had too many people trying to log on to their system, and it was bottlenecking, and people would not be able to get on, or the internet was very slow, which is a limiting factor, and actually ceased that nice nonlinear reinforcing feedback loop and kicked in the balancing feedback loop, where all of a sudden demand was exceeding capacity, which actually had a negative impact on sales. And I'm sure that in your organization, you probably felt that. In my own career, for instance, very early on as a young academic, I knew I had to go after tenure and that it was a lot of work. So I went after a lot of grants. I took along a lot of grad students and a lot of committee work, trying to be as useful as I can to the department and the faculty and the university. I was able to bring in lots of funding and lots of grad students. But I reached, just like anyone, my own limitations. And of course, there was impacts on even my own home life, because there was too much work to be done in a day, and I wasn't able to respond to the needs of my young family. And I recognized this limit, and I wasn't doing a good enough job on any of my projects or working with any of my students, or even to my department. I had taken on too much, and there was this limit, and the demand on my time was exceeding my capacity. And I'm sure you've recognized that kind of archetypal behavior, but it's very difficult to see when you've got this lovely feedback loop going. You don't often think about the limiting condition, but that's a really useful archetype to think about, and has all kinds of implications beyond sort of organizational dynamics. The other one, which I've found to be incredibly helpful, is this idea of this archetype of shifting the burden, where in the context of a particular issue, you might have a problem symptom of some kind, and there is a choice between a symptomatic solution or resolution to that problem, or a more fundamental solution to that problem. Both relieve the symptom, that is, they're balancing two interacting balancing feedback loops. The more the symptom increases, the symptomatic solution, as it's increased, will actually decrease the problem symptom. But if you actually engaged in a more fundamental solution, it may take longer and be more effort, and you'll see a little hash mark on the bottom feedback loop, which means a delay, which is difficulty in the amount of time or the amount of effort you'd have to expend. But it would also relieve the problem symptom. Unfortunately, what happens in the context of this, if you over-rely on the symptomatic solution, what you have is a nasty side effect, which is kicked off, which I think is covered up here, and actually undermines your ability to undertake the more fundamental solution over time. So in the case of the Braun article, he talks about the use of R&D staff, corporate level R&D staff versus developing local capacity in the context of a particular plant. There's pressure to deliver on a product. If there's any kind of problem, you end up relying on the R&D staff, and an over-reliance on that can actually kick off this unanticipated and unfortunate side effect of the attrition of local staff. Whereas if you had took the time to actually train local staff in the plant on how to solve the problems, they would feel more valued and they would be able to resolve the problem. It would just take a little longer and probably require more of an investment. And so again, if you rely on this symptomatic solution, you can actually end up undermining your ability to undertake the more fundamental solution. In my own practice, as an academic, I was part of a group led by my postdoc supervisor. It was a publishing machine. We had all kinds of projects. It was very well funded. And I was able to produce a lot of journal articles and able to attract a lot of funding because there was already this track record. I was told early on, though, by my then chair and the dean, that if I over-relied on this existing publication machine and didn't establish my own research program, that I would actually undermine my ability to get tenure because I would be perceived to be using the resources and the momentum of someone else's research program, which would not allow me to get tenure. And so that was another example of this. And I have a much more detailed system analysis based on the work of David Peter Stroh, who also uses these, that I can speak to at another time. So I would actually ask you, as part of this work, to think about a story or a narrative where you have been stuck in your work and see if one of these two patterns could help you to think about ways that maybe you are feeding into an existing archetype inadvertently. And if you then might be able to use this archetype to change or strategize a way of kicking in a more novelty receptive approach. So that's the first tool that I wanted to offer, was this idea of system archetypes. And again, in the Braun article, he describes all 9. And of course, in the work of Peter Senge and the Fifth Discipline, he describes them, and the work of David Peter Stroh, which is also, it's a more recent book on systems thinking for social change. And he uses these again to great effect. Another tool that I think is really helpful in thinking about systems change is the notion of a systems boundary. And one of the main reasons that I think it's a powerful tool is because we often forget that we are using boundaries. Boundaries, again, are in systems thinking and systems practice, are conceptual tools or heuristics that allow us to deal with and bound the complexity of a situation. Of course, it would be wonderful if we could be Dirk Gently from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Douglas Adams and follow any particular lead, because everything's connected to everything else. And therefore, if we do anything, we'll be actually helping to solve the problem. But of course, we don't have infinite time or infinite energy or infinite resources to be able to do this. So we have to bound our systems. But the problem is we often forget that we have used this powerful conceptual tool of a boundary to bound our systems. So we end up falling prey to this notion of bounded rationality, which has been defined in a couple of ways. Herbert Simon, a complexity thinker, talks about bounded rationality in decision-making. The rationality of individuals is limited by the information they have, the cognitive limitations of their minds, and the finite amount of time they have to make a decision. Very sensible. We have to bound things in order to deal with the complexity around us. The problem is we forget that we're doing this, which results in this sort of inadvertent bounded rationality. Donella Meadows also talks about this, and she talks about bounded rationality as people make quite reasonable decisions based on the information they have, but they don't have perfect information, especially about distant parts of the system. So sometimes when we're making decisions based on the information we have, if we don't look outside of our boundaries or even recognize that we have boundaries, which is why I often use this hand gesture, we can make really silly mistakes if we had just sort of pulled the boundary away from our face and ask some different kinds of questions. Which is why another thing that I get people to do when they're thinking about trying to kick in that novelty receptive part of their own function of their own brain or within their organization I ask them to think about the boundaries that they're using. So again, if you think about that stuck point within your organization, or a narrative or a story of your stuck point, ask these questions. What is the spatial boundary of the endeavor of the issue? There's probably some kind of property boundary or jurisdictional boundary, watershed boundary. What is the spatial boundary? And then you might ask as well, what is the temporal boundary? How far back in the past are we thinking? How far forward in the future are we thinking? Because that can make a big difference in terms of how we think about a problem. Both of these spatial and temporal boundaries are what critical systems thinkers like Ulrich and Midgley refer to as first order boundaries, boundaries out kind of in the system. There's also a second type of boundary, though, what I would refer to as a cognitive, psychological, or conceptual boundary. And that's this idea of a second order boundary. And so you might ask yourself, what is a cognitive, psychological, conceptual boundary? And the best example that I've come across recently is a work with the Center for First Nations Governance and Satsan, who is Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief that runs that organization. And he has worked on several of the Supreme Court decisions that have made the inherent right to self-governance in Canada a reality. And he argues that many nations that he works with suffer from a form of bounded rationality around the Indian Act and around Indian Act governance and around the governance associated with chief and council. This is a cognitive, psychological, or conceptual boundary that they are using without realizing it, that has been very effectively and unfortunately imposed upon them, along with all of the other terrible implementary acts of colonization associated with the Indian Act. This is a second order boundary, though. It's in here. And so it's something that is more difficult to be able to see or be able to diagnose associated problems with. So I might ask you, in your work around this particular stuck issue, are you suffering from a form of bounded rationality? And would it help to at least ask questions about the implicit spatial, temporal, cognitive, psychological, conceptual boundaries, and maybe actually change them to see how things might be altered just by changing the boundary? I remember work that we were doing with colleagues in the Fort Albany First Nation around a particular mining issue. And the boundary that the mining industry company was taking was a very specific, site-specific spatial boundary over a very short period of time, exploration to decommissioning, which made perfect sense in terms of the regulatory process they were engaged in and in terms of their involvement in the project. What they didn't realize was Fort Albany First Nation was defining this particular intervention, which was very site-specific and over a 26-year period in terms of early exploration to decommissioning. Fort Albany, especially the elders, were seeing it as part of a long process of colonization, marginalization, violence, impacts of residential schools, and of course the recent finding of many hundreds of Indigenous children. So this should be a trigger warning in the context of residential schools. They were seeing this mine as part of a long process of colonization in the context of their traditional territory, which had a much larger spatial boundary. So boundaries make a difference, and implicit boundaries can lead to bounded rationality. And so useful to question those. So again, thinking about system archetypes and boundary judgments. The last tool that I wanted to offer, which I think is really powerful, and again, very specifically, if you are working with people that look like me, white, cisgendered, heterosexual people that are relatively well educated. These are the kinds of Western science kinds of tools that will be attractive to them, that will speak to them, but will also open them up possibly to seeing things in a different way and asking different questions and doing what Vanessa argues in her work as being the work of anti-assholism. I know that I have been a cognitive and emotional burden on many of my Indigenous colleagues over the years, and they've been very patient teachers. And sometimes the work that I've done, I can see having implications for other people that look like me. And that's where some of these tools come in, and that's why I think they're so valuable. So the last point, the last set of tools is this idea of leverage points. These were developed by Donella Meadows and again have been used to great effect by many people. They are listed in reverse order. So number 12, 11, 10, 9, all the way up to 1. And that's done quite purposefully because number 12 is the least effective leverage point, according to Meadows and according to understanding dynamics within systems. In change work that I've done in working with amazing change agents or innovators, the one thing that they'll often say is if we just had more funding, the F word, or more staff, that is actually the least effective sort of leverage point that Meadows has identified here. So this idea of constant parameters, numbers, the amount of funding, the number of staff, the number of projects. These are all just simply constants, parameters, or numbers and not a very effective leverage point. Of course, they can be useful, but usually only within a broader sort of systemic understanding, which is where you get that if you start to move up in these leverage points. So we can think about the size of buffers, that is sort of the amount of funding you might have in a fund that you have access to, as opposed to constantly chasing funding, size of buffers, material stocks and flows. You can think of the same thing. As you go up through these leverage points and we get to things like number 7 and number 8, this is where we start to see the dynamics of systems kick in and where we can think about some of the archetypes that we discussed earlier. The strength of negative feedback loops or balancing feedback loops, and then the rate of growth in positive feedback loops. And then this is where archetype analysis is really helpful in helping you to diagnose some of the dynamics and the archetype or the archetypal behavior of systems, and is a much more potent leverage point than just more of something, more people, more money, because you're actually intervening directly in the system dynamics. Now, if you are effective in intervening in these, it can lead to funding and lead to more staff and that kind of thing. As we move up, we can think about the control and the structure of information flows. You can think about the influence of social media, being able to use that kind of information flow, the rules of the system. These can be laws or regulations that can really influence things. The power to add, change, or evolve a self-organizing structure, if you can actually use the power of self-organization to push the system in a particular direction. Think about the goals of the system. Most importantly, though, Meadows talked about these two pieces of the mindset or paradigm out of which the system and its goals and everything else is generated. If you can alter the paradigm, you can change everything from the goals to the way it self-organizes to the rules, information flows, feedback loops, all the way down to constants. And then ultimately, if you do the work of trying to recognize your own paradigm, trying to recognize some of your own biases, you might actually get to the point where you can transcend paradigms. I see this as, examples, or this might be an example of something like when Vanessa talks about braiding, and we're not there yet, but that is, I think, an example of the ability to transcend paradigms. Many people talk about, Albert Marshall talks about two-eyed seeing, or Willie Ermine talks about ethical space. I think these are spaces, these are abilities to be able to transcend paradigms. And I don't know many people that are able to do it. I certainly am not. But that would be a really powerful leverage point. Be able to move across paradigms and be able to see the possibilities associated with them and be able to speak to many people that might be able to change other people's paradigm, be able to surface those kinds of patterns of thought and behavior within a paradigm like modernity, and be able to then affect change in all of the underlying goals, self-organization rules. So I'd ask you in your work in system change, in your work in organization, what leverage points are you generally pulling? Are you usually just asking for and trying to figure out how to get more funding or build a bigger endowment, or are you actually trying to intervene in feedback loops? Could you use archetype analysis to help you with some of those feedback loops, a much more potent level? And are you working then at the level of information flows and rules or goals of the system, or even paradigms, and trying to transcend paradigms? So lastly, I'll just say, and you might want to think about this as you walk away from this brief presentation, what are the lessons that you might take away from thinking about systems and our thinking within systems, system archetypes, system boundaries and bounded rationality, as well as leverage points. But what is the so what of these tools? What are the lessons? What are the implications of these lessons? What can you now do with this? And then now what? What might you do with these insights in the context of your current and future work? How can you use archetypes, for instance, to diagnose patterns of thought and behavior and to be able to strategize about how to get out of them? How do you use boundary analysis and boundary judgments to circumvent and get away from bounded rationality? And are you overusing a particular leverage point? And there may be other ones that are more effective that you haven't even thought of engaging in. Anyway, thank you very much for your time and energy in listening to me. And I hope you found these tools useful and helpful. And I wish you well.